Hi everyone, I'm Bernard Sterling. I've spent over 40 years perfecting the art of sourdough and pastry in the heart of Savannah. My bakery, Bernard's Golden Crust, isn't just a business. It's my life's work built on sweat early mornings and a reputation for integrity that I thought was unshakable until my own blood decided to turn the law into a weapon against me. At 8:30 a.m., 2 police officers burst into my shop holding papers in their hands, eviction order. My name was printed on it in cold, sharp black ink, as if I had not been the owner of my own bakery for the last 4 decades. Officers Miller and Davis, who usually stopped by every morning for croissants, now looked at me with expressions of profound discomfort and hesitation. They weren't aggressive, but the presence of uniforms and black holsters right in the middle of my pastry counter made the air feel thick and suffocating. Standing behind the police were my son and his wife, silent, satisfied, dressed in sleek business attire, as if they had been preparing for this day for a very long time. My son stepped forward, his face devoid of a single shred of remorse, carrying only a cold, ruthless indifference as he spoke. You should have met my demands and signed those retirement papers earlier. Dad, now it's too late. Pack your things and get the hell out of here. We're taking over this place to save what's left before you ruin it with your senility. I didn't scream, nor did I allow my flour-dusted hands to tremble. I took a deep breath, looked Officer Miller straight in the eye, and calmly asked, "Can you show me who filed this petition?" He glanced at the first line of the order, paused for a heartbeat, and his expression suddenly shifted from professional neutrality to utter shock when he saw the name listed as the plaintiff. It wasn't a bank or some faceless creditor. If you believe that justice should never side with those who betray their own family for profit, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. The story of how I reclaimed my honor and made them pay the price begins right now. Officer Miller looked at me with an expression of profound pity as he flipped back to the first page of the heavy manila folder. The silence in the bakery was so absolute that I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall each second, feeling like a hammer blow against my chest. He cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the legal jargon before he finally pointed to a specific line. "Mr. Sterling, this isn't just a standard eviction. This is an enforcement of an emergency guardianship order granted to your son, Preston Sterling, and his wife, Jolene." The words felt like ice water in my veins. Guardianship. It was a term used for the helpless, the infirm, and those who had lost their grip on reality, none of which applied to me. I reached out my fingers, trembling slightly, as I took the document from his hand. At the very top, listed as my primary residence, was 402 Willow Creek Apartment 4. B. My breath hitched in my throat, because I hadn't stepped foot near Willow Creek in over 15 years. It was a dilapidated rental property I had sold long ago to fund Preston's college tuition. By listing that dead address, Preston had ensured that every court summons, every notice of hearing, and every legal warning had been sent to a mailbox I didn't own, in a building where I didn't live. It was a sewer service, a classic dirty legal trick designed to strip a man of his rights without him ever knowing he was being sued. Because I never showed up to defend myself at hearings I didn't know existed, the judge had entered a default judgment, effectively handing the keys of my life over to my own child. Preston stepped closer, leaning in so only I could hear him. His voice a sickeningly sweet whisper that didn't match the cold calculation in his eyes. "We just want you to rest, Dad. This bakery is too much for you to handle now, and we're going to take care of everything from here on out." Jolene stood beside him, her face a mask of practiced concern as she nodded in agreement, though I could see her eyes wandering toward my vintage brass cash register, already tallying the profits. I looked at the signature on the return of service page, the document that claimed I had been personally handed the court papers. It was a messy scrawl, but the printed name underneath made my stomach turn Jolene Sterling. She had signed for my papers at an address she knew was vacant, pretending to be an authorized occupant, just to check a box for the court clerk. They hadn't just lied to me. They had systematically lied to the entire judicial system of the state of Georgia. I looked back at Officer Miller, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl as I gripped the counter. This address is a lie, and they know it. I have been here in this shop every single morning for 40 years, and not once has a process server knocked on that door. I did not argue with those who were playing angels just to steal an estate. Instead, I quietly walked toward the kitchen, my boots echoing on the familiar hardwood floor. Preston tried to follow me, but Officer Miller placed a firm hand on his shoulder, signaling him to give me space to collect my personal effects. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. Yet I kept my face as smooth as the marble countertops I had worked on for decades. I knew exactly what they wanted: a tantrum, a breakdown, some tangible proof of the senility they had so carefully fabricated in their legal filings. If I started shouting, if I threw a rolling pin or broke down in tears, I would be handing them the very evidence they needed to justify my removal on medical grounds. I refused to give them that satisfaction. For weeks, I had noticed subtle discrepancies in the daily cash registers, small amounts, $20 or $50 at a time, always vanishing on the days Jolene volunteered to help with the bookkeeping. I hadn't confronted them then, choosing instead to quietly install a high-definition motion-activated camera concealed inside the casing of the vintage wall clock overlooking the office and the prep area. I knew Jolene was thorough, but she was also arrogant. She assumed an old man like me wouldn't understand how to bypass the shop's standard security system. She believed I was still living in the era of paper ledgers and analog tapes, never suspecting that my lapses in memory were actually periods of intense observation. "Don't take too long, Dad," Preston called out from the front, his voice echoing with a hollow sense of authority. "We've got a professional cleaning crew coming in at noon to modernize the place." I ignored him, reaching for a large, heavy stoneware jar labeled Specialty Rye Flour, tucked away in the back of the pantry. Jolene watched me from the doorway, a smirk playing on her lips, as if she found my attachment to a jar of flour pathetic. She didn't realize that the jar was a hollowed-out decoy. Beneath a thin layer of actual flour sat the external solid-state drive, wired directly to the hidden camera's wireless transmitter. I carefully pulled the drive out, tucking it deep into the pocket of my heavy denim apron, then grabbed a small wooden box of my wife's old recipe cards for appearances. As I turned to leave the kitchen for the last time, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door. I didn't see a broken man or a confused grandfather. I saw a master baker who understood that the best dough needs time to rise under pressure. I walked back into the main storefront, passing Preston and Jolene, without uttering a single word. I could feel their eyes burning into the back of my neck, waiting for a goodbye that I would never give. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the morning sun stinging my eyes, holding the recipe box tightly against my chest, while the cold weight of the hard drive in my pocket felt like a loaded weapon. The scent of baked goods still clung to my denim jacket when I stepped into the county administrative building with a rising sense of indignation. The sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways of the clerk of Superior Court's office were a jarring contrast to the warm, flower-dusted sanctuary I had just been forced to abandon. I didn't waste a second on self-pity. Instead, I marched straight to the records division, my footsteps echoing with a purpose that felt sharper than any anger I had ever known. I needed to see the foundation of the lie that had been used to dismantle my life. When I reached the counter, I presented my identification to a weary-looking clerk and requested the full file for the guardianship petition filed against me. As I sat at a small wooden carrel, My eyes scanned the documents Preston and Jolene had used to convince a judge I was unfit to manage my own affairs. There it was, buried beneath layers of procedural motions, a durable power of attorney. This was the master key they had used to bypass my consent, a document supposedly signed by me 4 months ago, granting Preston full authority over my business and personal assets in the event of my incapacity. I stared at my signature at the bottom of the page. To a casual observer, it looked identical to the one on my driver's license. But as a man who had spent 40 years meticulously decorating wedding cakes with intricate icing script, I saw the flaw instantly. The ink wasn't right. The pressure points were non-existent. I pulled a small magnifying glass from my pocket, a tool I usually use to inspect the crumb structure of my sourdough, and leaned in close. Under the lens, the truth became undeniable. The signature was slightly pixelated around the edges, a telltale sign of a high-resolution scan that had been digitally lifted from an old birthday card or a payroll check, and then perfectly overlaid onto this fraudulent legal form. Jolene's signature sat right next to it, as the primary witness, her handwriting neat and arrogant, attesting to a moment that never happened. She hadn't just watched me sign. She had orchestrated a digital heist of my very identity. My pulse hammered in my temples as I realized the sheer scope of their betrayal. This wasn't a sudden lapse in judgment on their part. It was a cold, calculated operation that required weeks of preparation and access to my private records. They had waited for a moment when I was distracted by the holiday rush at the bakery to file these papers, knowing I wouldn't be checking my mail at a property I hadn't visited in years. The clerk at the desk looked up as I requested official certified copies of the entire file. I watched the heavy stamp come down, thwack, 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 the sound of the system finally beginning to record the evidence that would eventually be its own undoing. I tucked the certified copies into my briefcase, the paper feeling heavy with the weight of the war I was about to wage. As I walked back out into the humid Georgia air, I realized that Preston hadn't just stolen a shop. He had handed me the very rope that would eventually tighten around his own legal standing. The chill from the air conditioner in the doctor's office was nothing compared to the icy stillness in my heart at this moment. I sat across from Dr. Eris Thorne, a specialist in geriatric neurology, who had known my family for years, holding the thick envelope of certified documents I had just retrieved from the county records. The room smelled of antiseptic and old paper, a sterile environment where reputations were either mended or destroyed. I didn't come here for sympathy. I came for a scientific rebuttal to the poisonous lie Preston and Jolene had injected into the legal system. I handed the doctor the purported medical evaluation that had been used to justify my guardianship, a document I had never seen until an hour ago. Doctor, Thorne's brow furrowed as he scanned the pages, his eyes narrowing at the signature of a physician I didn't recognize from a clinic on the outskirts of Atlanta. Bernard, this report claims you were diagnosed with stage 2 neurocognitive decline 6 months ago. He whispered, his voice tinged with genuine confusion. It lists symptoms of disorientation, memory loss, and an inability to manage complex tasks. But you were in my office for your annual physical just last quarter, and your vitals were perfect. I watched his face closely, searching for the moment the professional mask would slip. He turned to his computer, clicking through my electronic health records, his jaw tightening with every second that passed. "Someone has been busy," Dr. Thorne said grimly, turning the monitor toward me. "There are several unauthorized access pings to your patient portal from an IP address that doesn't belong to any medical facility. It looks like digital assets, specifically old lab results, were exported and then manipulated into this fraudulent letterhead." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Preston hadn't just guessed I was healthy. He had actively stolen my private data to craft a convincing medical fiction. They hadn't left a single stone unturned in their quest to bury me alive in a state of legal helplessness. I need you to test me, Aris, I said, my voice steady and resolute. Not a standard screening. I want the most comprehensive cognitive assessment you have. I want a record that no judge can ignore. For the next 3 hours, I was subjected to a grueling battery of tests. I solved complex spatial puzzles, recalled intricate strings of numbers in reverse, and explained the nuances of artisan bread fermentation, a process involving chemistry and timing that required absolute mental clarity. I didn't stumble once. My mind, sharpened by decades of measuring ingredients to the milligram, functioned with the precision of a Swiss watch. When the final results printed out, the score was a perfect 30 out of 30 on the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, followed by glowing remarks on my executive function. Dr. Thorne signed the new affidavit with a flourish of his pen, his expression one of fierce determination. This is an ironclad certification of your mental competence, Bernard. I'm also flagging your file for a HIPAA violation and notifying the medical board about this fraudulent clinic in Atlanta. I took the fresh, valid documents, feeling a surge of adrenaline that replaced the earlier coldness. The foundation of Preston's benevolent takeover was crumbling. He had based his entire case on the idea that I was a flickering candle losing its light, but he had forgotten that I was the one who controlled the heat in the kitchen. The judge slammed her gavel, demanding silence, as I stood up, holding the hard drive that contained the absolute unvarnished truth. The air in Department 12 of the Chatham County Courthouse was thick with the scent of old wood and the electric tension of a life about to be reclaimed. Judge Evelyn Vance looked down at me from the bench, her eyes sharp and weary from a morning of domestic disputes. Preston and Jolene sat at the plaintiff's table, looking every bit the grieving, concerned relatives in their muted gray suits. Their attorney had just finished a lengthy, dramatic plea about my deteriorating mental state and the tragic necessity of the guardianship to save the family heritage. They thought they had won. They thought their wall of paper lies was impenetrable. Your Honor, I began, my voice echoing with a clarity that seemed to startle Preston. I am here to move for an emergency stay and to vacate the default judgment based on fraud upon the court. My son and his wife did not just provide a false address to avoid service. They manufactured a medical and legal fiction to strip me of my agency. Preston's lawyer jumped up to object, citing a lack of foundation, but I didn't flinch. I handed the hard drive to the bailiff along with the fresh, certified competency results from Dr. Thorne. I watched Jolene's face turn a sickly shade of ash as the technician connected the drive to the courtroom's monitors. She knew exactly what was on that drive. The screen flickered to life, showing a time-stamped, high-definition view of my office inside the bakery from 2 weeks ago. The courtroom went dead silent as the video showed Jolene sitting at my desk, a stack of my old payroll checks fanned out in front of her. She was carefully using a light box and a high-resolution scanner, practiced and methodical, as she digitally lifted my signature and overlaid it onto the durable power of attorney document. The audio was even more devastating. Preston walked into the frame leaning over her shoulder with a grin that was purely predatory. "Is it done?" he asked on the recording. "Almost," Jolene replied without looking up. "Once the judge signs the emergency order, we can list the property. The developers from the convenience store chain want the contract signed by Friday. They're offering 3 times the appraisal value just for the lot." "He won't even know what hit him," Preston's recorded voice continued cold and dismissive. "The nursing home in North Carolina is already picked out. It's far enough away that he won't be able to bother us while we liquidate the assets." I looked over at the plaintiff's table. Preston was staring at the floor, his jaw working frantically, while Jolene looked like she wanted to melt into the mahogany chair. The benevolent children, who just wanted their father to rest, were now exposed as common thieves, plotting to sell a man's life work before his body was even cold. Judge Vance leaned forward, her expression transforming into one of cold, judicial fury. She looked at the forged document in the file, then back at the video of Jolene's digital surgery. "Counsel," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous level of calm as she addressed Preston's attorney. "Do you wish to explain why your clients are on video committing multiple felonies in the very office they claim they were trying to protect?" The lawyer stayed silent wisely, choosing not to sync with his clients. The judge turned her gaze to me, nodding once in a gesture of profound respect. "The stay is granted effective immediately," she declared, her voice ringing out like a verdict of fate. "And this court is not merely vacating the judgment. I am referring this entire file to the district attorney for immediate investigation into criminal fraud, forgery, and elder exploitation." The metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the courtroom like a final period at the end of every hope for reconciliation between us. Preston stared at his wrists in stunned silence, while Jolene began a frantic, tearful plea that no longer held any power over the room. Judge Vance didn't look away as she ordered the bailiff to escort them to the processing center for formal questioning. My son tried to catch my eye as he was led past my chair, perhaps looking for a flicker of the fatherly mercy he had spent his entire life exploiting, but he found only a wall of cold, silent granite. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I felt a profound, heavy clarity. The boy I had raised, the child I had sacrificed so many early mornings for, had been replaced by a stranger, consumed by a hunger that no amount of artisan bread could ever satisfy. An hour later, I stood back in front of my bakery, the Bernard's Golden Crust sign creaking slightly in the afternoon breeze. The police tape was gone, and the silence of the empty shop felt like a sanctuary rather than a tomb. My first act wasn't to turn on the ovens, but to meet with a locksmith I had called from the courthouse. I watched as he removed the old cylinders, replacing them with high-security locks that required a biometric scan, a digital barrier that ensured no stolen key or forged authorization would ever breach these doors again. I then sat at my desk and drafted a final letter to my estate attorney, officially removing Preston's name from my will and revoking every sentimental provision I had once made for his future. The severance was absolute, surgical, and permanent. This ordeal taught me a lesson that is written in the very scars on my hands. Family is a bond of blood, but respect is a contract of the soul. We often think that our years of devotion and sacrifice buy us safety in our old age, but the truth is that greed can corrupt even the deepest roots. Never allow your love for someone to blind you to the necessity of legal boundaries. I learned the hard way that a paper trail is the only shield against those who would use your own history as a weapon to bury you. I spent decades perfecting recipes for the town to enjoy, but I've realized that the most important thing I ever built wasn't a tiambon. It was the strength to stand alone when the people I loved most tried to turn the world against me. As the sun set over Savannah, I went back to the kitchen finally at peace, knowing that the only hands that would ever touch this dough again would be honest ones.